The wind swept across the barren plain, carrying with it the dry taste of dust and the faint creak of leather as the wagon wheels rolled forward, the sun blazing down from a sky so sharp and clear it felt as though it could cut. Elias Kane rode alongside, a tall man with the lean frame of one who had lived his life in the saddle, his hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing, his hand resting lightly on the worn grip of his revolver. He had been hired for one purpose: escort the young woman seated at the front of that wagon across hostile country and deliver her safely to the mining town of Red Hollow. Nothing more. That was what the rancher who paid him had said, nothing more. And Elias had intended to keep it that way, for he had long ago stopped believing in dreams of peace or love. The West had a way of burning those out of a man. But then he looked at her, and something in him shifted like dry ground under sudden rain. Clara Whitfield sat straight despite the heat, her back proud, her eyes ahead on the long road of dirt and danger that stretched before them. She was no stranger to loss. Elias had seen that in her silence, in the way her lips pressed together when talk turned to family, in the careful way she clutched the locket at her throat when she thought no one was looking. She had hired him not out of choice, but necessity. Raiders had struck her homestead, leaving fire and ruin where life had once bloomed, and now all that remained was to make it to Red Hollow, where her uncle waited, a man she barely knew but who had promised her shelter. Elias had seen such promises before, and he wondered what kind of man this uncle might be, but it wasn't his place to question. His job was clear: get her there alive. Yet even as he told himself that, the truth pressed against the walls he had built inside, he wasn't just watching the road, he was watching her, noticing the determination in her jaw, the shadows of grief in her eyes, the way her voice, when she finally spoke after miles of silence, carried both fragility and steel. "You've done this before," she said softly, her gaze still on the horizon. Elias nodded once, his voice rough but steady. "More times than I care to count." "And the women you've escorted, did they make it?" The question lingered between them, heavy as the sun. Elias did not answer right away, because memory was a cruel master, dragging him back to faces he had failed to save, voices silenced by gunfire or thirst. Finally, he said, "Most did." She looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes there was no judgment, only a quiet understanding that unsettled him more than anger would have. He turned his gaze away, back to the endless road, back to the horizon where danger was surely waiting. He reminded himself again, nothing more. But the road has a way of testing a man's resolve, and the desert has a way of stripping him bare. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke the next evening as Elias and Clara rode along the edge of the canyon, thunder rolling low and hungry across the open sky, the first drops of rain hitting the dust and turning it to mud in uneven patches, the air charged with a strange, restless energy that seemed to echo the turmoil. Neither of them spoke aloud, for though Elias had told himself 100 times that he was merely her hired escort, every stolen glance at Clara, every word she offered him in that quiet, steady voice worked its way deeper under his skin until he could not deny that he was no longer simply leading her to Red Hollow but following her into a place he had never thought he would go again, the dangerous territory of hope, of yearning, of love he could not escape. Yet with that came a fear sharper than any bullet, because Elias Kane was a man carved by loss, and love in the West was a fire that could warm or consume. And as they rode into the storm, the shadows of the past rose like ghosts around him, memories of others he had failed to protect clawing at his conscience, whispering that he would bring only ruin to this woman who still managed to smile at the rain even after fire and blood had stolen everything she knew. But Clara, unlike anyone he had met, was not simply surviving, she was choosing to keep going, to carry light in a land where darkness was law. And he found himself drawn to that light against his will, as if she were the only star left in a sky gone black. The storm thickened, lightning split the heavens, and Clara's horse spooked at the sudden crack, nearly throwing her, but Elias was there in an instant, his strong hand steadying the reins, his voice low and calm against the fury of the sky. And when she looked up at him with rain streaming down her cheeks, their eyes locked in a moment that felt longer than the whole weary road behind them, a moment that spoke of everything unspoken, of fear and trust, of longing and restraint, of two souls meeting at the edge of fate. And though Elias broke the gaze first, forcing himself to focus on the trail, the truth had already been written between them like words carved into stone. He was no longer just her escort, and she was no longer just his charge. They were bound by something deeper, something neither could deny. The dawn broke over Red Hollow with a pale light that painted the town in shades of gold and ash, the clapboard building still damp from the night's rain, the muddy street empty save for a stray dog sniffing at scraps near the saloon, and Elias Kane rode at Clara's side knowing full well that their journey was meant to end here, that the contract which bound him to her was fulfilled the moment she stepped into her uncle's care. Yet as the town drew closer with every hoofbeat, the weight in his chest grew heavier, for he realized that somewhere along the endless miles of desert, canyon, and storm, he had ceased to think of her as cargo to be delivered and had begun to see her as the reason he still drew breath, the reason he had not given himself over to the grave that had been waiting for him all these years, and though he told himself that once she was safe he would ride on, find another job, another road, the lie of it was bitter on his tongue because his heart had already betrayed him, already chosen her, and as they passed the first buildings, Clara turned her eyes on him with that same quiet strength that had carried her through fire and loss, and she said softly, almost like a prayer, "Elias, what happens to us now?" And the words struck him harder than any bullet, because they weren't the words of a woman saying farewell, they were the words of someone who felt the same pull he did, someone who feared the ending as much as he did, and though he wanted to answer, the moment was stolen as a man stepped from the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, a broad figure with a sharp gaze and the same steel in his jaw that Clara carried in her own, her uncle, come to claim her, and just like that the fragile hope between them trembled on the edge of breaking, for Red Hollow was no place of peace but a town ruled by greed and the shadow of violence, and Elias knew the story was far from over, that the love he tried to resist would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The sun set behind Red Hollow in a blaze of crimson that bled across the sky like a warning, and Elias Kane stood on the edge of town, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his heart torn between the instinct to ride away and the impossible pull that kept him rooted near Clara, for though he had sworn to himself that once he delivered her to her uncle his duty was done, the truth was carved deep in his bones. He could no longer walk away from her, not when danger still prowled these dusty streets, not when he had glimpsed the tenderness in her eyes that no outlaw or storm could take from him, and as the lamps in the saloon flared to life and the sound of laughter and broken glass spilled into the cooling air, Elias felt the weight of Red Hollow pressing in on all sides, a place where greed fed violence and where men like him often found their graves. And yet it was here, in this cursed little town, that he felt the stirrings of something worth fighting for again, something worth dying for, and when Clara stepped out onto the boardwalk of her uncle's house, her figure framed in the glow of lamplight, he saw the flicker of worry in her face, as if she knew the storm was not yet over, as if she too could sense that the bond between them had already crossed a line no one could erase. She walked toward him, her skirts brushing the wooden planks, her voice low but steady as she said, "You don't have to stay, Elias," and though the words offered him freedom, her eyes pleaded for the opposite, and he found himself answering in the only way his heart allowed, "I reckon I do," the admission falling from his lips like an oath, binding him to her and to whatever came next, and in that moment he knew that the West was not done testing them, that the love he had tried to resist was about to be forged in fire and blood, and he would follow her into it without hesitation. Night in Red Hollow carried a weight heavier than the desert heat, the kind of silence that wasn't peace but a warning, broken only by the rattle of shutters in the wind and the distant howl of a coyote on the ridge, and Elias Kane knew the town was holding its breath, waiting for the violence everyone could feel pressing in like a storm about to break. For word had already spread that the outlaw gang who'd burned Clara's homestead had trailed them here, drawn by greed and vengeance, and though Elias had thought he had left that life of blood behind, he felt the old fire stirring in his chest, the instinct of a man who knew how to fight when there was no other choice, and as he leaned against the post outside Clara's uncle's house, the glow of her lamplight spilling across the dirt street, he realized that what bound him here was no longer duty but love, fierce and consuming, the kind of love a man like him had no right to but could no longer deny, and when Clara stepped out onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill, her eyes finding his in the darkness, he saw that she understood without a word, that he was ready to stand between her and the fire, ready to give all that he was, and that no matter what came riding out of the night, they would face it together, two souls bound by something stronger than fear, stronger even than death itself. Dawn bled slow and red across the desert sky, painting the jagged ridges in fire as Elias Kane stood at the edge of Red Hollow with the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders, the smoke of spent gunpowder clinging to his coat, the echoes of battle ringing in his ears, for the outlaws who had hunted Clara had finally come, and they had been met with steel and lead, a storm of violence that left the town shaken and silent. But though Elias's gun had spoken true and his body still carried the sting of near-fatal blows, it was not survival alone that filled his heart but the sight of Clara kneeling beside him after the last shot had faded, her hands pressing against his wounds, her tears mixing with the dust on his skin as she whispered his name like a vow she could not lose, and in that moment he understood with a clarity that cut through all the pain, he had not just been hired to escort her, he had been led to her, as if the same cruel West that had taken so much from him had finally given him back the one thing he thought he'd never find again, love, raw and undeniable, fierce as the land itself, and though others in Red Hollow muttered that the fight was not over, that more blood would come with the rise of the sun, Elias looked into Clara's eyes and knew that whatever trials lay ahead, whatever fire they still had to walk through, he would not turn away, for the West had carved him into a man of grit and silence, but she had carved him into something more. A man with a reason to stay, to fight, to live. The weeks that followed the gunfire in Red Hollow brought a quiet unlike anything Elias Kane had known in years, the kind of quiet that felt both fragile and foreign, as if at any moment the desert itself might rise up to shatter it, yet within that stillness he found something he never thought he would hold again, life alongside Clara, not as her hired escort nor as a man passing through, but as someone who belonged. And each day that dawned over the wide, merciless sky carried with it small moments that rooted him deeper into her world, the way she laughed when he fumbled at fixing the fence behind her uncle's house, the way she sang softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, the way her hand found his when they walked the dusty street at dusk, as natural as breath, and though Elias was a man carved from shadows and silence, each touch, each glance, each word she gave him chipped away at the walls around his heart until he could no longer imagine a world where he rode off alone. Yet even as love wove itself between them, the West was not a place that allowed peace to last, and Elias knew it, felt it in the wary eyes of the townsfolk, heard it in the whispers of riders spotted on the horizon, and when a stranger came into Red Hollow one afternoon with a black hat pulled low and a scar twisting the corner of his mouth, Elias recognized the shape of old trouble and understood that the story he and Clara were writing was far from its final page, that fate had not finished testing whether the fire between them was strong enough to withstand the storm yet to come. Up